Good evening, everyone. We are going to continue with the halakhot of muktzeh. Tonight we're going to study the halakhot of shemelachto le'isur. That is a muktzeh of a vessel that is forbidden to do on Shabbat. Its general use is forbidden to use on Shabbat. Meaning, and we'll see a couple examples tonight, but it means that in general, you wouldn't have picked up that item. There was no use for that item on Shabbat, but it is some sort of vessel, and we'll see what that is tonight. So some examples just off the cusp are, for example, a woman's purse. Right, a woman's purse. It has some uses for it that can be used on Shabbat, for example, carrying things, but also it usually has in it also money or writing utensils, and so for that reason we would consider it a kli shemelachto le'isur. The general rule for kli shemelachto le'isur is that we're not allowed to move it for its protection, meaning either from the sun or from robbers or something, but we are allowed to move it letzorech gufo, meaning that it's needed for a permitted act, or letzorech makomo, meaning the place that it is sitting under, or where it's placed. So the what is, first of all, let's try to define what is a kli shemelachto le'isur. So there's a machloket as to how exactly we define a kli shemelachto le'isur. One of the opinions is that as long as more than 50% of the time it's used as a instrument that would not be allowed to use on Shabbat, then it's considered a kli shemelachto le'isur. So, for example, a hammer, right? A hammer, I would say more than 50% of the time, I'm using it to hammer nails or doing building or destroying with it. Therefore, that would be considered a kli shemelachto le'isur. Now, the other opinion is that it's not necessarily an item that you use more than 50% of the time for something that is not allowed to be used on Shabbat. Rather, it should be exclusively used in such a manner that it would not be used on Shabbat. So, for example, let's say like a pencil, right? A pencil, I'm 99.9% of the time using a pencil to write things down, meaning that it's a kli shemelachto le'isur. I have no use for it on Shabbat. And if that's the case, then it would be a little bit more restrictive as to what we define as kli shemelachto le'isur. So the first opinion is, as long as the majority of the time I'm using it as an item that is not allowed on Shabbat, then it is considered kli shemelachto le'isur. And the other opinion is it should be used almost exclusively for that item, for that purpose. The halacha generally follows the second opinion, and so as long as it's mostly exclusively used for that purpose, then we say that it's a kli shemelachto le'isur, and therefore one would be able to move it letzorech gufo, letzorech makomo, but you were not allowed to be moving it for to save it from robbers or anything. So again, a pencil or a pen is a good example of that, since at that point you're using, a majority of people use it exclusively to write or to erase, and since that is forbidden on Shabbat, that would be considered a kli shemelachto le'isur and would not be able to be moved for the sake of saving it, but one would be able to move it letzorech makomo and letzorech gufo. And just again, I want to repeat, this is since it's the third shiur, I know you guys already remember, but just for those who joined us or who haven't heard the other past two shiurim, that when we're talking about moving letzorech gufo, letzorech makomo, or moving any of these muktzeh items, we're specifically talking with our hands, meaning picking it up with our hands and moving it. We've talked about before that blowing, kicking it with your leg, using your body to move the item, all of these would be allowed in these situations, and we're looking generally to find if it's permitted to pick it up with our hands or do we have to implement one of these other methods? So, other items that are considered kli shemelachto leisur would be, for example, gas stoves, paintbrushes, empty frying pans, pencils, pencil sharpeners, sewing needles, erasers, umbrellas, electric lamps, nails, I guess also drills or all of this stuff, scissors, a saw, sandpaper, a ruler, a pen, a hammer, pliers.
Is it okay to ask a question?
Yes, I see your question. Are they allowed to move in those other ways because they're not common? They're not the common way to do it. Correct. Since that's not the common way to do it, also one of the reasons why all of these issues of muktzeh even show up, the reason why the sages were decreed the issue of muktzeh is because they were afraid that people would carry the items from one domain to another domain. And since you're not going to be carrying it when you're moving it around with your foot or you're moving it around with your body or blowing on it, so you're not going to be coming to accidentally carry it from one domain to another domain, which would be a prohibition on the Shabbat. Also, according to the other opinions that say that we wanted to make a distinction between Shabbat and the rest of the week, since during the rest of the week, like you said, is not the common way to pick up those items, it makes a distinction between the rest of the week and Shabbat. So, one of the kelim, one of the items, the vessels that we said that are kli shemelachto leisur, is an empty saucepan. Now, it depends on how that empty saucepan is used. Now, if it's used exclusively for cooking, or an empty frying pan that is generally used exclusively for cooking, then it's going to be a kli shemelachto leisur, because like we said, it has to be generally exclusively used for a item that is forbidden to do on Shabbat. Since cooking is forbidden to do on Shabbat, then this empty saucepan or empty frying pan, even though there's nothing inherently wrong with it on Shabbat, there's nothing muktzeh about it, it would be under the category of kli shemelachto leisur, and one would not be able to move it letzorech gufo unless it was letzorech gufo or letzorech makomo, unless he needed the place under it or he needed to use it for another item. And so therefore, if someone wishes to transfer some cooked food into this pan or into this saucepan or into this frying pan to store it there, he is allowed to do so because that's considered letzorech gufo. Since the general way that it's used is cooking, then letzorech gufo, meaning it means that you're using it in a method that is kind of its purpose, it's what it's made for, but it's not generally the way of doing it. Like what we said, for example, we talked about a hammer. The general use of a hammer is to hammer in nails. Now, if I don't have a nutcracker or something, I can't open up a nut, I'm allowed to take that hammer and open up the nut, even though the hammer would be a kli shemelachto leisur. But because I need it, it's letzorech gufo, I need it for a objective that is permissible to do on Shabbat, then I can use it. And so in this case where I have an empty saucepan and I want to store food, leftovers in it, so I'm allowed to take it and put food into it, letzorech gufo, because that would be considered for its own sake. So that would be the case, of course, as long as it's it's allowed to be moved. It's not electric or anything, right? Of course, if it's an electric, I don't know if they have electric pans nowadays, but that would, of course, not be allowed to. That would not be considered kli shemelachto leisur. Now, if it was a pot that is generally exclusively used for cooking, sometimes the woman or chefs, right, in general, they like to make it in the pan and then they just leave it there, put it on a warming tray or putting it in a place where it's able to be warmed and keep it like that until Shabbat starts, and then they serve it just like that. Now, you would have said that it's a muktzeh, right? Because it's kli shemelachto leisur. But the general rule is that whenever Shabbat starts, we look at the vessel, and we look at the matzav. We look at the what's happening with that vessel. At this point, at Ben Hashmashot, right before Shabbat starts, as Shabbat starts, if it has within it the food, then it's no longer considered a kli shemelachto leisur, because at that point it's a basis, it's a base for food, and it just becomes, it nullifies its aspect of a kli shemelachto leisur, and it becomes a kli that it's a basis, it's a base for that food, and it would be permissible to move even without letzorech gufo and letzorech makomo. Meaning, even after you ate it, and you ate all the food within it, and now it's an empty saucepan. You said an empty saucepan is kli shemelachto leisur. You told me that I'm not allowed to move it unless it's tzorech makomo, tzorech gufo, and unless I need it for the place that it's sitting on, or for another permissible use for that. Nonetheless, we're going to say that if it started Shabbat with food in it, then it transforms it into a basis of heter. It becomes a kli shemelachto leheter because it had the food in it and you needed it to move around. At that point, we say even after it has been emptied, then it has the status that Shabbat only that of a kli shemelachto leheter. Now, there are some poskim that disagree and say that the status of it is as long as the food is within it. And if that's the case, then as long as the food is within it, then it's a kli shemelachto leheter. And then when you take the food out, then it reverts back to a kli shemelachto leisur. Now, since there's this conflict between the opinions, we generally hold like the more stringent opinion. But if there's a case, for whatever reason, for some an extraneous case where someone needs to move this pot that had food in it during the beginning of Shabbat, and now that it was emptied because it was left outside and a robber can come take it, there is some room to be lenient and allow it to be moved. But in general, we should try to be more stringent in that case. And so, once we understand that, then this opens a new understanding for kli shemelachto leisur. Because if we're saying that it follows the attribute that it had once Shabbat started, then we know that at that point it can be changed. So, for example, if a pot contains a non-muktzeh item inside of it, like a loaf of bread or some other type of food, like we were mentioning, then as it's permissible to move the utensil, even if you needed to move it so it doesn't get ruined in the sun, or so that robbers don't take it. For whatever purpose, it does not have to be letzorech gufo, letzorech makomo, because in general we said that when there is a non-muktzeh item within the kli, within this vessel, even though the vessel itself would be considered a item that is muktzeh, and if it was an empty vessel, you would not be able to move it unless for its own sake or for the sake of its place. Nonetheless, once you put the non-muktzeh item in it, once you put the food or the bread or whatever it may be in it, then we say that one is able to go ahead and transform it into a non-muktzeh item. And so if that's the case, if for whatever reason there is a kli shemelachto leisur, any of these items that we talked about, an empty saucepan, an empty frying pan, a pencil or a pen or a ruler, whatever it might be, and you needed to protect it and you don't want it to be, you forgot it outside, and for whatever reason you're worried about robbers or the sun or whatever is going to destroy it, then we're able to use this leniency of placing a non-muktzeh item on it and then making it a base for this non-muktzeh item, and therefore you would be transforming it into a non-muktzeh item, and you would be able to move it even for a purpose not for itself and not for its place. So what does that mean? That means if for whatever reason I had a empty pot left on top of my car before Shabbat started, and now I'm worried that someone's gonna steal my very expensive pot. I don't know what was very expensive about it, but I guess it was very sentimental. And for whatever reason, I can't move it now. There's no letzorech gufo or letzorech makomo. I don't need the place. I don't need the car, and I also don't need any inherent use from that pot. So what can I do? I can take a loaf of bread. I can take some food or whatever, maybe crackers or whatever. Place it inside the pot, and then I can move it into my house so that it is not stolen or not ruined by the sun. And that way I can take advantage of this. Now, this is only a leniency with regards to muktzeh of a kli shemelachto leisur. So it's only the items that we're going to talk about today. So those items that we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, kli shemechamat chisaron kis, a item that is made specifically and generally only for that item. For example, we talked about a laptop, right? You would not be able to take advantage of this leniency and place a non-muktzeh item on it and transform it into a basis. Similarly, with regards to what we talked about last week with muktzeh mechamat gufo, that items that are inherently muktzeh because there is no use for them on Shabbat, we said stones, wood, things like that, you would not also be able to take advantage of this leniency, placing a non-muktzeh item on it in order to move it freely. This only applies to kli shemelachto leisur, these items that we're going to talk about today, and therefore one is able to place a non-muktzeh item in it, and allowed to move it on Shabbat. For this reason, I heard from Rav David Yosef that if someone needs an alarm clock on Shabbat, they can leave their phone on with an alarm clock on Shabbat, and when the alarm goes off, they should place a candy or some kind of food next to it. Then you take that candy or food, you place it on top of your phone, and then you can move the phone, of course, without hitting any of the buttons and making you can't touch any of you can't turn off the alarm, and you can't touch any of the buttons, but you would have to maneuver it. You would be able to move it at that point into a place, like into a drawer or into a cupboard, so that you would not hear the excessive beeping. But the idea is that you're taking this kli shemelachto leisur, you're taking this vessel that is a muktzeh item, that is a kli, it's a vessel that has no purpose on Shabbat. It's exclusively used for items that are not used on Shabbat, and you are able to transform it into a base for something that is allowed to be moved. Okay, and so it changes the game a little bit, but at least once someone understands and once we recognize what each vessel can be or what each item is, then we would be able to recognize what the item is and how to appropriately categorize it with these halakhot. B'ezrat Hashem, I'll try writing up something on these and handing it out. That way we can kind of make it a little bit more simple. That way we can make sure that these items and these different talking points are all properly understood. So b'ezrat Hashem, I'll hope to get on that. When we're saying letzorech gufo and letzorech makomo, we've mentioned this previously, but just to hit the nail on the head, right? So we're saying that letzorech gufo means that one wishes to use the utensil for a permissible purpose on Shabbat. Meaning, like the famous example we mentioned earlier, is that a hammer, even though the hammer majority of the times you're going to be using it to hit nails or to break drywall or whatever it might be, if I need it right now for a permissible purpose to open up a nut, for example, that is allowed to be done. Similarly, if I need if I take a matchstick and I use it as a toothpick, right? So that also would be considered letzorech gufo, that I'm using it in a permissible manner. And then we said also the other the ability to move these items is letzorech makomo. And we said letzorech makomo is you need the place where it's lying under. So for example, if that hammer or a pen or pencil was lying on the dining room table and you needed the dining room table, you're about to have the seudah of Shabbat, you're going to eat there either in the night or in the morning, whatever it may be, you need the table, all right? At that point, you're allowed to move the item because it's in the place that you need. And we said, though, that even if it's outside and it's going to get ruined by the sun, or we're worried about it being stolen, that would not be considered letzorech makomo, letzorech gufo, and you would not be able to move it for those reasons. So we mentioned a match. So unused matches are considered kli shemelachto leisur, and therefore, if you needed letzorech gufo, if you needed it to, for example, you wanted to use it as a toothpick, or letzorech makomo, or you needed to move it from the dining room table for whatever place that you needed. Maybe it was on someone's pillow and they need a pillow. At that point, you can move it. Again, we're saying when we're talking about moving, we're talking about specifically moving it with your hands. Of course, if you want to be extra stringent and you use your elbow or use your foot, whatever it may be, that would be permissible. Here we're talking about the kind of the most level, the most you can go with extending the laws of muktzeh, meaning when can I move it around with my hands. Now that's with regards to an unused match, but a used match would be considered muktzeh mechamat gufo. It has no purpose, nor on Shabbat, nor during the week, meaning it's already used. At that point, it would be forbidden to move it letzorech gufo or letzorech makomo, and you would have to implement one of those methods of using your elbow or blowing on it to move it off the table. A telephone book or a telephone directory is considered muktzeh on Shabbat in this category of kli shemelachto leisur, because it's exclusively generally used for calling people. And nowadays, I don't know if they still have telephone books. Maybe the telephone books nowadays aren't used for finding people's phone numbers. They're used for either like swatting flies or to help balance a table. I don't think anyone really uses the telephone books nowadays. So maybe the law of telephone books is a little different than it was back then. The idea being that if it is an item that is exclusively used for a non-Shabbat item, an example was the telephone book, right? Where a majority of the times that someone would use it is to look up someone's phone number, meaning you need to call them. That would be only done on non-Shabbat, not Shabbat, because on Shabbat you're not allowed to call them. So at that point, you would say that it is forbidden to move letzorech gufo unless it's letzorech gufo, letzorech makomo. What would be considered letzorech makomo? In this case, you would say that looking up someone's address in that book, for example, is considered letzorech makomo. It's considered a permissible use of that item, and therefore one is allowed to use that on Shabbat. Some poskim ruled that any item, for example, like a wax candle, that can be used only in a manner that is forbidden on Shabbat, right? The only way you can use a wax candle is lighting it, and lighting is forbidden on Shabbat. And there's no alternative use to it, meaning how else am I going to use a candlestick? I'm not going to use a candlestick to, I guess, to floss or something, to use it in another manner. That would be considered muktzeh mechamat gufo, and so it's not a kli shemelachto leisur. So a wax candle, the example we gave right now, since it has no other permissible use to it, then it would be considered a kli shemelachto as a muktzeh mechamat gufo, and it would be forbidden to move letzorech gufo, letzorech makomo. So I guess another example might be like a electric drill, right? An electric drill, you have no use for that on Shabbat, and there's no People generally don't use an electric drill to hammer anything or to break something, and so in that sense, it would be considered muktzeh mechamat gufo. It would be forbidden to move it, nor for its sake, nor for its place. An item that is technically maybe used on Shabbat, but people are generally pious and they refrain from using it. For example, a bicycle, right? A bicycle or a scooter. Right? There's really generally no prohibition to use it on Shabbat, other than that's a uvde dechol. It's a manner of a weekday manner, and so in that situation, even though the item itself is not allowed to technically be used on Shabbat, it does not have a status of muktzeh because it's only a stringency with it. Now, other poskim ruled that an item such as a bicycle, if it can't be used on Shabbat, then it is muktzeh. And so, generally, again, like we said earlier, if you have this machlok, you have this dispute between two sides of the sages of the poskim, then we generally rule with the more stringent opinion in this situation, right, with regards to muktzeh. And then we want to say that we generally are stringent in not moving any of these items, bicycles, scooters, or any of these items that are not inherently forbidden on Shabbat, but the sages prohibited them for so that there's safeguards, so that we don't come to do anything that is forbidden on Shabbat. And so these items, generally you shouldn't move them. But now let's say someone forgot their bicycle outside and they're worried that it's going to be stolen. And so in that situation, if someone was to move it into their house, right, then we say that he has on what to rely on, and he's allowed to. He can do that. That's permissible in that situation. Again, in these extraneous situations where it becomes he needs it for so that it's not stolen. At that point, then we allow him to do that with these items, bicycles, scooters. Again, these are items that are inherently not muktzeh, and the sages decided that they were considered prohibited, so that we make a distinction between the rest of the week and Shabbat. And so these are considered pious items that people generally refrain from using. We consider that muktzeh out of stringency. But if there is a need for it, then we're allowed to move them. A lamp, an oil lamp, or I guess candles, right, that were burning during the time that Shabbat started, during the sunset, then even after they're extinguished, they may not be handled. So this is the opposite of what we mentioned earlier. Earlier we mentioned, and it's the same law, it's just on the different side of the spectrum, meaning over there we were lenient, over here we're going to be stringent. The general law is at sunset, we define that item as it was during sunset. And since at sunset, these candles, this oil lamp, whatever it may be, was burning, it was muktzeh, at that point it establishes itself as muktzeh even after it stops burning, even after the light goes out. Previously we mentioned about the pot of food, right? The pot itself, it was an empty pot. We would have said that it's an item exclusively used for cooking, and therefore it would be forbidden. It would be muktzeh in the category of shemelachto leisur, because at the beginning of the Shabbat, right, it's a muktzeh item, right? Now we're saying, and then we said that if you place food in there, permissible food in there, then it turns it into a non-muktzeh item, because now it has that food in it, because that was the status of it at Ben Hashmada, at sunset. And we said even if he takes out the food, it would still have that same status. Now over here, we're looking at the opposite end of the spectrum, meaning over here it was candles, and of course they were forbidden once Shabbat started because they were alit, they had light in it, they were on fire. Now, even if the fire is extinguished, we still hold them as a kli shemelachto le'isur. They still have that same stringency. Even so, and then it has an extra stringency that even if one places a loaf of bread on it, that we may not handle the lamp. This is generally used only for a kli shemelachto le'isur. Over here, we're saying that it's this is going to be considered a because we mentioned earlier, for example, that the wax candles are muktzeh mechamat gufo, and since this is a category of muktzeh mechamat gufo, then you're not allowed to place the bread on it and move it. That's with regards at least to the candles themselves. Now, let's say the candles were on a tray, right? And then you placed on that tray also a item that was like a piece of bread, or better to do is to have a permissible item on it as Shabbat starts. So then that base, that tray that the candles are on, is considered a base for a permissible and a prohibited item. That way, once let's say you lit the Friday night candles at the table, and they're on this tray with both the candlesticks, the candles, and also this piece of bread, for example, then you would be able to move it on Shabbat with no problem. It would become a problem if you didn't have any of the bread there, right? And then it was just these candles. Even if they go out, you're not allowed to move them because they become muktzeh, and you wouldn't even be able to move them mechamat gufo. You wouldn't even be, or mechamat makomo. You wouldn't be able to move them for the sake of its place, because it's not considered a kli shemelachto le'isur. It's considered muktzeh mechamat gufo. And if that's the case, you're not allowed to move it letzorech makomo. You're not allowed to move it for its place. Meaning, if it's on a shulchan Shabbat, even if it's on the table, then it would be forbidden to move it as is, and you would have to go ahead and either, in this case, you wouldn't be able to even put a piece of bread on it, because that would not be allowed to, because it has the status of muktzeh mechamat gufo, which you're not allowed to go ahead and place the bread on it. That would only be allowed for on Shabbat, at least, for kli shemelachto le'isur. And so it's kind of complicated, but we try to learn the halakhot as best as we can, and we try to then apply this to our lives, to Shabbat as best as we can, and we continually learn. This is a continually learning process. It says that we categorize a Torah scholar. We say he's a talmid chacham. Talmid chacham literally translates to a smart learner, meaning he's always learning. A smart person in Judaism is never stagnant. We're always learning more. And so all of these halakhot seem very complicated, very convoluted. And B'ezrat Hashem, I'll try making it a little bit less. But the idea is that it's a continual process. It's not that I learned the halakhot once. It's not like a biology test where you take the test after, and then it's like, okay, I forget about it after. I don't know what a DNA is made out of after the test. No, Torah, Shabbat, all of these halakhot, it's a continual process that you don't learn it once. It's a lifetime of learning, and you go back and learn it again and again and again. Make sure that you don't forget it. Even the Rav Ovadia and all of the sages say that if someone wants to make sure that he keeps Shabbat 100%, then he always has to learn the halakhot of Shabbat. You can't say, I learned the halakhot of Shabbat in 12th grade in college. I learned the halakhot and I'm good to go. I know all of the halakhot. Hashem says, no, that's not how it works. I'm going to make you forget it, right? And the human mind is we forget it. And so if you don't continually review these halakhot, of course you're going to forget it. It's human nature. So again, they seem kind of convoluted, but B'ezrat Hashem, we come and we try to learn them as best as we can. Whatever sticks. And if it doesn't stick on the first round, it'll stick on the second round. So, B'ezrat Hashem, we said that with regards to kli shemelachto le'isur, we have certain dispensations that we're allowed to move it, and let's just kind of give a summary on those abilities, those permissibilities of when we're allowed to move these items for any reason. So if one was allowed to lift the item for any reason, then we say that he's allowed to move it to any location. So once it's already in my hands, then I'm allowed to continue moving the kli shemelachto leisur anywhere that I want. So, for example, if we said for the pot, right, the pot that I had the piece of bread in, and I put the pot that was on my car. I was afraid that it was going to be stolen, so I put a piece of bread in it. That made it into a kli that I'm allowed to now move. It's no longer a kli shemelachto leisur because it has the bread in it. I'm allowed to move it, right? I moved it into my house, and then what did I do? I took the pot and I flipped it over and put the bread on the countertop. At that point, the kli, the vessel, goes back to a kli shemelachto leisur, and it's muktzeh. But the sages said, once it's in your hands, and once you're already moving it, at that point, you don't just have to drop it. You can continue to move it and place it wherever you want. So now if you want to put it into a cupboard, you can go ahead and do that, even though the piece of bread is no longer in the actual pot, in the actual pan. Similarly, and this is a leniency with regards to kli shemelachto leisur, is that you're allowed to go ahead and pretend that one needs it letzorech gufo, or that one needs to use the place where it is located now, and then once it's in your hands, again, you have this ability to move it wherever you want. So, for example, let's say I have a pencil on the table, and so I pick it up, I'm like, oh no, I have to start making set the table for Shabbat, and then you can say, oh wait, I'm not eating here for Shabbat, but now the pencil's already in my hand, so what am I going to do? I'm going to go find a place, and I'm going to put it in a place that it won't be a bothersome. And that would be a special dispensation here with kli shemelachto leisur, that you can pretend to need it letzorech gufo, letzorech makomo, and once it's in your hands, at that point you're allowed to move it any place that you need. Okay. In general, now this is again generally speaking, we said that you can move these items and any items indirectly with your body, not necessarily the hands, right? Specifically talking about not the hands, a foot, an elbow, in a way that you're not normally carrying them. Again, you can move them indirectly. So if you have like we talked about money. If someone had money in their pockets, they can kind of take the money in the pockets and move and kind of mina'er the how do you say to shake out the pockets, to shake the clothes in order for the money to come out. That's indirect, or indirect even like taking a chair and moving it such that it can move the muktzeh item away. We said blowing on an item is permissible to move the muktzeh item. And we said a special dispensation also for kli shemelachto leisur is that you're allowed to place a non-muktzeh item on it, and then you carry them together as long as it's a kli shemelachto leisur. Also, we're allowed to instruct a non-Jew in order to carry them if it's needed for the sake of its safety or the sake of its so no one will steal it or gets destroyed. And similarly, if one believes that he needs this item later on Shabbat, then he can move it now, even though he doesn't need it necessarily right now. So if, for example, with the hammer, right? If someone has a hammer and he knows that right now he's not going to be eating walnuts, but he needs it for seudah shlishit when he's going to be eating these nuts, then even though right now it's not seudah shlishit, right now he's not going to go ahead and eat those nuts, nonetheless, he's allowed to move them starting from now to a safe place. And so with regards to pretending that one needs to use it, it's we're saying that the idea is that one should use this in order for protecting the item, whether it's from the sun or from robbers. You should go ahead and use this only in those special situations where he needs to do that for the safety of the item. If someone wishes to tidy up the house, right, he has guests coming over, and he wants to make the house look a little more tidy, and he has some of these items that are considered a kli shemelachto le'isur, let's say pencils, colored pencils, paper, markers, whatever it may be, that is lying around, and he wants to just, he says, this is letzorech makomo, I want to move it so it looks a little nicer. If your intentions are just to make the house look a little cleaner, that would not be considered letzorech makomo, and you would not be able to move them directly with your hands in that manner. You'd have to either indirectly move them with a different part of the body, but this is not considered a letzorech makomo, and you would not be able to move these items if that was your sole purpose for making the house tidy. If one accidentally picked up a muktzeh item on Shabbat, that's considered a kli shemelachto le'isur, or really in any of these items, any of these muktzeh items that we've talked about until now, once it's in his hands, he does not need to drop them. Okay, so if don't worry, if you picked up your laptop on accident, you don't need to just drop it on the floor and say, "Oh, it's Shabbat." All right? No, you can go ahead and move it to where you need it, and then once you place it, then you know that it's not allowed to be used on Shabbat. You should, if let's say it's for whatever reason, like a one-handed object, like let's say you accidentally picked up your phone, right, which is a muktzeh item, right? It's a muktzeh kli shemelachto le'isur, and you said, okay, now I have to move it, and so you're holding it in your right hand, and you go to open the door. So what do? You open the door with your right hand. So you put it to your left, and then they say no. Once it's in your right hand, even though it's one body, so that you're not really transferring it from one body to another body. Nonetheless, you should refrain from transferring it from one hand to the other hand. And so if I picked it up with my right hand, I should leave it in my right hand until I put it down. Of course, if I do this instinctively or something happens, it's just like the case of forgetting that it's a muktzeh and picking it up accidentally. Again, you don't have to throw it on the floor and be like, oh shoot, it's muktzeh. No, continue, put it in a safe place or wherever you need to place it, and then continue on. A Swiss Army knife that has some of these different tools, scissors, nail clippers, whatever it may be, and it has a knife in it, right? Now the knife is considered a valid object. It's permissible to use a knife on Shabbat. And so at that point, we're saying that one is allowed to technically use this Swiss Army knife as long as he's using it for that knife, right? He's not using it for the scissors, he's not using it for the nail clippers, and so he should make sure not to pull out those compartments, leave it as the knife, and he's allowed to move it. And then let's say it's sitting on his countertop and he needs to move it, even if it's not letzorech makomo, he's allowed to move it because at that point it has a knife in it. That's of course true as long as all of the compartments to that Swiss Army knife or whatever it may be has a permissible use to it. If it's one of those like pliers that you can open and it has different like Phillips head screws and stuff like that, no, that would be considered a kli shemelachto le'isur, and you would only be able to move it letzorech gufo, letzorech makomo. A fan that is plugged into the wall is we're lenient, and you're allowed to move it as long as you're not pulling it out of the plug. Of course, that would not be allowed, and of course, not changing any of the controlled settings. It's recommended to put a sign that says Shabbat or something on it so people would know. But let's say your room was hot and you needed to move the fan on Shabbat to kind of go on you more. At that point, it's allowed to be done. On the other side, though, with regards to heaters, they're a little bit more stringent because heaters are considered a basis ledavar ha'isur, since they have like some kind of heating element in it, and it's the heating element is considered some sort of like fire. So we assume that it's a little bit more stringent in that it is housing it is the base for a forbidden object, meaning that kind of like fire, that heating element, whatever it may be. If that's with that in that manner, and so with that in mind, the poskim ruled that that these items are muktzeh, and therefore, with regards to how to use them, we're a little bit more stringent in that only if someone needs them in a situation where, let's say, it's very cold, and they of course it has to be on during Shabbat. You can't turn it on Shabbat. Talking about it's already on, and you just want it to like move it, right? So in that situation, we say that these items are muktzeh, and we should generally refrain from moving them. If one needs to, there is some rule to be lenient. With regards to electric water heaters, okay, so those ones that keep the water warm on Shabbat, this is considered also a muktzeh item. Again, that also has the heating element in it, and therefore you should not move it letzorech letzorech makomo in a normal settings. If there is, for whatever reason, a need for it, just like what we said with the heater, if there's a dire need to move it, then we're lenient in that you can move it letzorech letzorech makomo. But in a general manner, you're not allowed to move these items letzorech letzorech makomo. Similarly, or maybe not so similarly, a warm air humidifier, which is an air humidifier. It's a humidifier, but it spits out warm air rather than the mist is warm rather than cool. Okay, there's going to be a distinction. So with regards to a warm air humidifier, we're a little bit more stringent, and we say that it is muktzeh. But since generally people who need it are those who are more ill, they can't breathe for whatever reason, muktzeh is allowed to be moved for sick or ill people, and therefore we allow it for them, but not for a general a person who is healthy is not allowed to be moved. Now, on the opposite side, a cool mist humidifier that spits out the cold air, that is permissible to move even for a healthy person. Again, as long as you're not pulling out any plugs, and as long as you're not turning it on or switching it off or changing any of the settings. With regards to adding more water to a warm air humidifier, one is allowed to, but it has to be from a kli rishon. It has to be one that's was on a fire, and it has to be still hot when you add it to it. And of course, there can't be any indicator lights that go on or any kind of lights or electricity that would happen because of that, because that would be in and of itself its own issue. And then similarly, you would be able to add water to a cool mist humidifier, also any of those fans that blow mist, right? You're allowed to add water to those as well. Again, as long as it has to have been running. You can't add it at a point where it can't have stopped. If it's stopped, right? Then you can't add water to it in any of these cases, because then you're starting it again. You're making the electricity flow again. That would be forbidden. It has to be working, and in the course of it working, you're allowed to add the water to it. In this case, even cold water. In the warm air humidifier, you have to make sure that you're adding hot water to it, and it's specifically from a kli rishon. Another item that sometimes we're not so cognizant of that is muktzeh is water that drips from an air conditioning unit, or any kind of water that drips from a condensation of an air conditioning unit. We're more stringent with that, and we say that they are considered muktzeh. Now, if someone's house, for whatever reason, the AC unit was dripping in their house, and they don't want it to drip on the floor, all right? So what do? They can't put an empty bucket under it because that would be mivatel kli. You're nullifying the kli, you're nullifying the vessel, and that would be forbidden to do on Shabbat. So instead, the trick is to fill the bucket with a little bit of water that you got from the sink, and then put it under the dripping air conditioning AC unit or whatever it may be. That way, these droplets are falling into a bucket of water rather than an empty bucket. A step ladder that is generally used in the house is non-muktzeh at all. You're allowed to move it. Where it gets a little bit more tricky is with a regular ladder, because a regular ladder is generally not used in a house unless it's for painting or for building or whatever it may be. And so a regular ladder would be considered a kli shemelachto le'isur, and therefore it would be muktzeh. And even though that there are opinions that says that you can be a little bit more lenient with that, it's still forbidden to carry it from place to place. Because onlookers may suspect that the person is painting or building on Shabbat. So we generally refrain from moving these ladders on Shabbat. They're considered muktzeh. So unless you need it for letzorech makomo, letzorech gufo, that's when it's permissible. With regards to medicines, now this is another item that people don't pay attention to often, is that medicine for a healthy person is muktzeh, right? Because there's no need for the healthy person, no need for the medicine for a healthy person, at least for himself, right? And so if he wants to just kind of look over the medication or to look at it, he's not allowed to move it. Again, if he needs it letzorech makomo, letzorech gufo, is in the middle of the coffee table and he needs to put his coffee on it, then he's allowed to move it. I'm not sure a case of letzorech gufo for this, where you need it for its own purpose, maybe as a coaster or something, I don't know. At that point, that would be allowed to be used. Now, of course, if a healthy person is getting the medication for someone who's ill or someone who's sick, that's permissible. That's not an issue. We're talking about specifically that the person himself does not need the medication. And if for whatever reason the person became sick over Shabbat, then he's also allowed to take that medicine on Shabbat, and it doesn't become muktzeh for him, even though he was healthy when Shabbat started. Now that he's not healthy, he's allowed to use those items, use those medicines on Shabbat. That's with regards to medicines. Vitamins, on the other hand, have no restriction, and therefore vitamins are allowed to be handled on Shabbat. Barbells, dumbbells, all of these weightlifting items, or any kind of item that's used generally for exercise. So there's a machloket dispute whether one is allowed to use these items on Shabbat. Some poskim rule that exercise is forbidden as long as one intention is to sweat. If it brings you to sweat, that's forbidden. On the other side, they say as long as one is not, on the other side, since these items are in general used for objects, they're uvd dechol, they're used for mundane acts and has no benefit to the sanctity of Shabbat, then it's forbidden to handle at all. It will be completely muktzeh. So the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, they rule more leniently. They say that it's only forbidden to move these items if one's intentions are to bring one to sweat. So if one was tired and he wanted to do some push-ups to wake himself up, that would be allowed. If someone took a barbell and started doing some curls, whatever it may be, in order to wake himself up. Not his intentions are not to sweat, or to just wake himself up. That would be permissible. But of course, they're according to that opinion, right? Which that's the opinion we're going to hold. They become a kli shemelachto leheter. It's a permissible used item, and so it would not be considered a kli shemelachto leisur. We'll just end it off with one last item, and then I'll leave it open for questions. Is cigarettes, right? Cigarettes. Those are muktzeh because you're not allowed to use them on Shabbat, and so they may not be handled on Shabbat. You're only allowed to move them letzorech gufo, letzorech makomo. I'm not sure again for an item that would be used for letzorech gufo, but letzorech makomo, if you needed that place, it was sitting on the dining room table, and you needed the place on the table, you're allowed to move it. Similarly, with bus tickets, train tickets that someone needs, if he's going to be right after Shabbat, he wants to get on that bus. Those items, those tickets would also be considered muktzeh and should not be handled, at least in the normal manner, on Shabbat. Okay, let's open it up to questions. Any questions?